5. All right, everybody. Thank you for being patient as I start with Chapter 8, The Tree of Life. When I passed through the gate stone, I knew we were in a different kind of place because I'd feel a change in the quality of air and light. The air became richer and more concentrated. I took a deep breath just because it felt so good. I opened my eyes, just a crack, and immediately snapped them shut. The light wasn't painful like it was on sunny days at home, but the sun was much brighter than I'd ever seen it. I could feel its warmth on my face and enjoyed how substantial it felt. That was a word, though I didn't think of it till later, substantial. After a single breath, I was overcome by the feeling that this place was more real than reality at home. I immediately understood what Aunt Mattie had meant about northernness. After my first few seconds on the other side of the gate stone, I felt stronger and more alive than I had before. I was filled with the spirit of adventure. There was this feeling that I could do anything I set my mind to do. I wondered if this is how Superman felt when touched by Earth's yellow sunbeams. Jo told me later that her experience was similar, but what amazed her more than anything was the odor of the air. In Freyerton, the air smelled clean and sweet. That was nothing compared to the air of Yggdrasil. She felt like the air was providing her with nutrition, like she would never need to eat again. It smelled so clean, so green, so real compared to the air she'd breathed for her whole life so far. We opened our eyes slightly, then all the way. What we saw was breathtaking. We were standing in a room-sized hole in a tree larger than any on Earth. Brown bark lined the inside of the hole, and it was smoother and browner than the dense, chunky, gray bark that started to grow on the tree immediately outside of the hole. The room was made entirely of wood, but it was all of one type. I could tell that it had grown that way, or something like that. It all looked and felt natural. Jo and I poked our heads out of the tree. I became immediately disoriented. I looked downward from the hole and saw a line of trees growing sideways. A few men were walking along the base of the trees. They were sideways too. A large glass rainbow appeared to weave its way through the trees. Everything was off by 90 degrees. My eyes told me that I was poking my head out of a hole in the ground, that I was looking along the trunks of youngish trees, but what my body told me is that I was looking down, that what looked like ground was oriented vertically, and that the trees were growing horizontally. I swooned. Jack caught me. It can be a bit disorienting at first. Are you all right? Yes, I said. Jo looked a bit unsteady, but she hadn't come so close to fainting like I had. I felt nauseated and probably looked it because Jack immediately said, "Here, let me give you something to drink that will help." He walked over to a basin sitting on top of a wooden cylinder that appeared to be part of the floor. Golden light was shining from the basin. "It's quite all right," he said. "Please join me." Jo and I went over to him, and he told us to pick up the cup beside the basin. It was made of oval leaves which had been pressed together somehow to make a curved bowl. It looked too delicate to touch, almost like it was made out of tissue paper. "What if one of us breaks it?" said Jo. "It's all right," said Jack. "You won't. Would you care to go first?" Jo shook her head. "That's all right. Stevie can go." I picked up the cup and was shocked when the edge of one of the leaves cut me. Not a paper cut. I mean like a real cut, like a knife would do. I yelped and dropped the cup. "I'm so sorry," said Jack. "You see, I've not taken anyone from Midgard to Yggdrasil before. Let me see your hand." I held it out, and Jack said, "Let's see if we can make it as good as new." He picked up the leaf cup, which had simply bounced, and dipped it into the basin. "Here," he said, "drink this, the lifeblood of Yggdrasil." He held the cup with both hands. It shone with gray light, just like the basin. I put my mouth to it and took a sip, careful not to cut my lip on its edge. The liquid was sweet and savory at the same time, but not sugary or salty. It tasted like trees smelled, plus honey and something a bit spicy. It tasted alive. I swallowed and coughed, a little surprised by the peppery aftertaste. I could feel a change come over my body. I felt myself grow substantial like the air and the light. When we'd first arrived, I'd felt almost see-through, like everything around me was somehow more than I was. Now I belonged, and I felt a surge of energy and strength. Jack said, "Let's see about that hand now." I'd forgotten about that. I held it up, and there was still blood on it, but the cut had already healed. "That's amazing!" exclaimed Jo. Jack scooped up a cupful and offered it to Jo. She drank. Her eyes grew wide, and she silently smiled at me, this big expression of joy on her face. "Now," exclaimed Jack, let's continue on our journey." "But how?" I said. Joe inserted, "Yeah, the ground outside doesn't make any sense. Why is it going the wrong way? I mean, why does it feel like down is that way," pointing toward the floor, "but from the way that the trees are growing, it looks like down is that way," she pointed toward the rear wall. "Remember," said Jack, "you are somewhere that is different from every other place you've ever been. You're in a different sort of place. Some of the rules that you're used to don't apply." He paused. "Take another look. Imagine that we're in one gravitational field and the trees are in another. Imagine that the floor is down for us within the tree and that the center of Yggdrasil is down for those standing on the surface of the tree." We went back over to the opening and held on to the side. I still felt disoriented, but I was no longer woozy when I looked out of the hole. We peered upward and saw the huge sideways trees. "Do you see anything strange?" Jack asked. "Regarding the ground from which the trees are growing, perhaps?" Joe looked at the closest tree. "The trees aren't growing out of the ground. They're growing out of tree bark instead of dirt," I interrupted. We were inside a tree so huge that other trees were growing out of it the way that they grow out of the earth's surface. I turned around to face Jack and peppered him with questions. "So where did all those other trees come from? Who planted them? How did they grow out of tree bark? Why does it not kill this tree that we're inside?" "Again," said Jack, "examine your premises. Every question that you ask is a good one, but they all have the same answer. There is only one tree." "Only one?" said Joe, who had also turned around. "That doesn't make sense. What are those, then?" She pointed out of the hole. Jack looked thoughtful for a moment and said, "In Midgard, there is a tree called the aspen. When you see a grove of aspen trees, you are typically only looking at a single organism. There is a colony in the western United States that is believed to be 80,000 years old, though the individual trees within it are quite young, perhaps 150 years old at most. But I digress. The tree in which we are standing, Yggdrasil, has stood since the creation of the 9 worlds. As the worlds age and grow, so does Yggdrasil. However, it grows outward as it grows upward. As it has grown over the centuries, it has started growing what appear to be copies of itself from its bark. No one knows why it's happening, not even your father, and he is one of the best woodsmen I've ever seen." Joe started. "Excuse me? Woodsmen. They tend to Yggdrasil's needs and care for the smaller copies to ensure that they remain healthy. This is where your father learned his craft before making his permanent home in Midgard." Before she could ask him for a more detailed explanation, he said, "We had better move along." He stood up and led us out of into the lip of the opening. Suddenly, an oversized squirrel hopped down from one of the many trees growing out of Yggdrasil. He landed right inside the opening of the tree, directly in front of Jack's feet. The squirrel started chattering and squeaked at Jack. "Why, hello, Ratatosk. It's good to see you, too. Yes, I'm bringing the children on to Bifrost just so that they can get a feel of things. Say, could you do me a favor? Please ask Heimdall to send our friend, the Draco Benevolus. Yes, we'd like to show the children as much of Yggdrasil as possible, not just the part that Bifrost spans. You will? Thank you so much." Bifrost is a bridge made from a rainbow. It's hard as stones and smooth, not like glass, but like old slate, with tiny ridges and bumps here and there that felt like they'd been softened by time and wear. What made Bifrost so otherworldly is that it was almost completely transparent. The contrast between its edge and the sky beyond was clear, but when we looked through it, we saw virtually no distortion. It did not appear to be solid. It looked like any rainbow, just like a piece of the sky. It took a moment for my eyes to get used to it because it wound around the tree in a spiral that led upward. A little strip of the rainbow ran outward from the tree hole where we stood and joined Bifrost proper, the way that a spoke joins a wheel. Jack turned to us and said, "Walking on Bifrost is a curious experience. Until you get used to the sensation, you will feel as though you are standing on nothing at all, that you are about to fall through the sky. The first step is the most difficult. You must override your instincts, for it is unnatural to step into what appears to be open sky. You will be intellectually aware of the fact that you are stepping onto something solid, but this does not make it any easier. The first step is the most difficult. It requires belief that there really is a bridge there, regardless of what your senses tell you." He paused again, so that we could say something if we wished. Neither of us did. "Belief is a curious thing. One of the things that, quite frankly, I misunderstood in life. I thought that a person could think their way into belief, but it's actually the other way around. Belief comes first, and then your mind fills in reasons for it. Bifrost is quite real. That is all you need to believe in order to step out onto it, and then experience will confirm your belief. You may feel very strongly that you will fall if you step onto Bifrost. I can assure you, you will not. The first step of moving from belief in one thing to belief in another often seems impossible. Allow me to assure you, it is not. The step takes a mere instant every time for every individual who takes it. The thought of walking on Bifrost filled me with fear and dread. I couldn't imagine actually doing it. Jack talked too much sometimes, but it helped make sense out of what I was feeling in this particular moment. Later, I learned that the Rainbow Bridge does not want to be walked on. Its purpose is to protect Midgard and the High North from one another. The main way it does this is by making people not want to step onto it. If just anyone could walk on Bifrost, then traffic between Asgard and Midgard would increase over time, which would make both worlds unstable. So everyone feels terror when they think about stepping onto Bifrost, and only a few people do. Only the very foolish, the extremely courageous, and people who are highly disciplined. None of these described me and Joe. We sat down and tried to conquer our fear. The more we sat and thought, the worse it became. After a few minutes, Joe asked, "Jack, why are we here? I can't move at all. If we go backward, we'll fail whatever it is we're supposed to do. And I just can't bring myself to step out of the tree. We are here so that you might see the High North and have context for your upcoming lessons," he replied. She sounded a bit whiny. "But why do we need lessons? Why now?" Jack looked like he was searching for an answer. Joe answered her question with another. "Our dad is in trouble, isn't he? He needs us, right?" She didn't wait for an answer. "We've been brought here for a reason. And maybe it has nothing to do with Dad, but I think that it does. I think that he needs our help, and I'm willing to go through anything to help him." She stood up. "Stephen, fear seems like something that we can't get around, but we can. It's just a feeling like any other. Feelings are just feelings. They're not real things like this tree and the Rainbow Bridge. We just need to have courage. We can do this." She paused, and her face changed slightly. "I can do this." She looked at me, smiled, and said, "I'm braver than you are, Stephen." She stepped out of the tree and onto the rainbow. When her foot touched it, she was energized and couldn't understand why she'd been afraid in the first place. "You can do this, Stephen. It's nothing compared to the dog yesterday." I was still afraid, but I couldn't let Joe do something so simple and let my fear conquer me. So I stepped out onto the bridge beside her. The fear that we had overcome was the result of an enchantment, but it took as much courage to overcome it as it takes for a person who fears water to go swimming. When we stepped onto Bifrost, our energy rose immediately. The strip of rainbow that we had stepped onto was about 10 feet wide and curved upward and counterclockwise. 20 or so feet ahead, it merged into the main rainbow, which was very wide, about 40 feet or the length of a school bus. The main rainbow, Bifrost proper, curved around Yggdrasil like a corkscrew with a flattened spiral. Some of the smaller trees growing out of Yggdrasil made a sort of canopy above Bifrost, the way that branches of very tall, old trees sometimes form a canopy over a road. The sky beyond the canopy was an incredible shade of blue, richer than the most beautifully saturated blue sky from a perfect springtime afternoon at home. As we walked around the tree, we saw the blue turning darker and becoming a night full of stars. The twinkling stars seemed alive somehow, and as we walked up and around the other side of the tree, the night turned into a vertical strip of a sherbet sunrise, all orange and raspberry and lemon. After a very long time, we had walked up one spiral of Bifrost. "Jack," said Joe, "did we just walk through a day?" His baritone voice rang out pleasantly as he answered, "Yes, backward to yesterday. Time on Bifrost is a curious thing. The world between the worlds lives outside of time, and its day and night are governed by forces other than the simple rotation of planets. When we return home, we will walk forward, and time will even itself out relative to our position in it." I had realized that Jack said things that I just couldn't understand, so I didn't try to make sense out of that. I noticed a little path joining Bifrost close up ahead, and looked identical to the one that we had used. I asked, "Is that a place up there like the one that we came out of? Does it lead to one of the other worlds?" Jack said, "It is a gateway, but it does not lead to one of the other worlds. Bifrost connects Midgard and Asgard only." "How do people get to the other worlds then?" "Ah, now that is an interesting question. Centuries ago, one could go from Midgard to the other worlds by traveling through certain areas, this forest, that river, One had to know where they were and how to access them. At some point, either right before the end of the first stage or right after the beginning of the second, those paths were all closed. "What's the first age?" I asked. It was a period of time before the first Ragnarok, after which the High North changed forever. He explained unhelpfully. What's Ragnarok?" asked Joe. I knew what it was in the comic book world, but kept my silence. "Ragnarok," Jack said, rolling his R's. "Gotterdammerung, the twilight of the gods. It is the time when everything draws to a close. Brother turns against brother. Loki escapes from his terrible torment. Garm's howls rip through the night, and Fenrir the wolf breaks his bounds and is free. He swallows the sun, and the 9 worlds are plunged into darkness. Giants wage war on the gods, and the wicked children of Loki and Angrboda rise up. Fenrir the wolf, Jormungand the serpent, and Hel, the queen of the dead. The gods die by blade, tooth, and claw. Odin and Thor and Heimdall, Freyr and Freya and Frigg, Vidar and Valia and Idun, Modi and Magni and Nanna and Sif, and Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil." The sky seemed to grow dark and serious as he spoke, but I think it was probably just the effect of his deep, booming, majestic voice. Joe objected, "But you said the first Ragnarok. It sounds like you're describing the end of the world. How can there be more than one twilight of the gods?" "Your question contains the germ of the answer. After twilight comes the darkness of night. And then what follows?" She thought for a moment. "Morning?" Jack nodded and smiled slightly. "Precisely right." Jack stopped walking for a moment and looked upward through the rainbow spiral. "I do hope that Ratatosk hasn't gotten too distracted," he said to no one in particular, "though one does take that risk when relying on a squirrel." He spoke in his normal voice. "We were discussing the coming of dawn after the dark. Is something bothering you, Joanne?" He began walking again, and we followed. "No," Joe said, "but so after the world ended, it began again, is that right?" "That's correct in a matter of speaking," Jack answered. "It's unclear how many times Ragnarok has been followed by rebirth, but most scholars agree that the most pivotal Ragnarok was the first one, which occurred in the year of our Lord 1208. "You don't know how many there have been, but you can narrow one down to a certain year 800 years ago?" I asked. "Give or take a couple of years, yes," Jack replied. "The High North accounts for time differently than Midgard, you see. There is a relatively solid historical record for everything that happens in Midgard. For the people of the Northern Europe, history was transmitted orally for centuries, and our understanding is vague until they became a seafaring people and began invading countries with a written tradition. In the High North, most history is transmitted orally from one generation to another, as it used to be in Midgard, and when it is recording in writing, actual historical events are mingled with legendary ones. Gods are funny that way. At any rate, I'm sure you can see what a muddle it is." I didn't see what a muddle it was. I knew how muddled I was at the moment, though, and I asked him to explain more. Jack said, "The cultures on Earth that were connected with the Aesir and the Vanir, those of the Scandinavia northern Germanic peoples, had been undergoing a change for a few centuries. In 1208, they attributed their victory in battle to Odin for the last time. This coincided with the end of the First Age, when Ragnarok was recorded in writing for the first time. There may have been others prior to this one. If so, they are lost to prehistory." "And after that, they made it so people couldn't go to the other worlds anymore?" Joe asked. "That's correct. Odin did. Once humans had turned to other religions, he shifted the mission of the Aesir to worlds other than Midgard. It had become a lost cause, and he began seeking alliances with other realms, ruling as equals rather than gods. You must understand that children of Midgard did not go to the other 8 worlds unless they were brought to them by someone from the High North. Exceptions include people with a mixture of human and High Northern ancestry, such as the Volsungs and Bodvar Bjarki, who traveled freely between the 9 worlds. Joe was looking intently at Jack. She asked, "You mean people like us, don't you? Are you one?" "No, I am not," he answered. "I have no reason to believe so, at any rate." "So, are you a regular person from Midgard like Mr. Kingsley?" I asked. "I used to be," he said. "What changed?" I asked. "If you don't mind our asking," inserted Joe. He smiled and said, "Of course I don't mind. I died." "You died?" Joe said. "And then what happened?" "It's a curious thing, you know. After I died, I simply awoke outside Valhalla. Naturally, I had no notion of where I was. This was in the early 1960s, so I've been around for many years." "Wait," I said, "so you're a ghost?" No, he answered, I am a resurrected man. What do you mean resurrected? Joe said. Jack heartily said, I mean that I was reborn in Asgard as the same individual I was on Earth. I simply have a different sort of body than I did before I died. It's quite remarkable, actually. Oh, I said quietly because I was confused. I wanted to ask him if dying hurt, but I didn't. Joe said, but why? Why did you come back, I mean? I don't know. I do know that in life I loved northernness. It called to me. It told me that there was a world beyond the small one in which I grew up. I lived a normal life, grew old, and died, and all along northernness pointed me towards something greater than myself. I guess we looked nervous because he said, You needn't worry. I am a person just like you. My body is simply different than it once was. I have the vitality of life, yet I lack many of the marks that make a person human. I am physical, corporeal. I have a body, but it does not seem to follow the rules of bodies. I don't age, for one thing. I don't have to eat or drink in order to live, though I may do so for the pleasure of it. I cannot get sick, or I don't think that I can. Once I fell from a great height, but when I hit the ground I merely bounced without pain. On rare occasions I have been able to do all sorts of strange things. Walk through walls, become invisible, change my appearance at will. But why are you here? Why aren't you up in, well, you know, Joe said. She flicked her eyes upward and pointed upward a bit with her hand. Oh, in heaven, Jack said. She nodded. Ah, well, that question used to bother me quite a bit. The answer that I've settled on is that we can speculate about heaven, but that is the best that we can do. I like to think that before going on to collect my reward, or perhaps as part of it, I have been allowed to experience northernness itself. I have seen the lands of the Aesir, the grand halls of Asgard, the ice and permafrost of Jotunheim, the unsettling desolation of Niflheim, the glorious majesty of Alfheim. I once had a dear friend who would love more than anything to walk through Alfheim. He tapped his leg a couple of times and looked sad for the first time since we had met him, but he quickly shook it off. Are you okay? I asked. Yes, I'm fine, he said. Thank you for asking. I'm simply thinking of John. Philia, the love of friendship, is a rare thing. Friends live in memory long beyond the days of friendship itself. A moment later, he pointed into the sky and said, Look, here comes our dragon. All right, and that's the end of chapter 8, and I think I'm done for the night because my voice is starting to get scratchy, and we have plenty of nights left. There is, you know, an infinite number of them, basically, for all intents and purposes. So I'll continue again tomorrow night. I'm going to try to continue doing this each day. I do a terrible British accent. I apologize to all folks in England who I have offended with my horrific accent. I don't know why people from England could do American accents, but it doesn't work the other way around, but that's the way it is. And a fun thing, I see my friend Mark online. Hi, Mark. See if you can guess who Jack is. A little clue is his initials, which were spelled out in a previous chapter, were CSL, and he wrote about Philia and had a close friend named John who loved elves. Those are a few clues. He was a real person. So with that said, I'm going to stop this video, and I hope you all have a fantastic night. Bye.